Oh, it's already recording. Never mind. Thank you, Amy. Well, welcome everyone who could make it. We appreciate y'all coming out. Brittany is an awesome AGU program manager in the public affairs department. We met because I'm part of the Voices for Science program, and she gave some excellent trainings on advocating for science policy, which is what I would say the good form of lobbying, which has oftentimes a negative connotation. She's a Georgia native, so not too far away from here in North Carolina, and she started her career as a comparative literature and international affairs major, so close to my own heart, and then moved on to law. And she started working in policy right away in the House of Representatives, moved on to a lobbying firm working with nonprofits, and then a senatorial campaign, and then actually started with the American Geophysical Union pretty early on in 2015, or early on in her career. And that's where she's been ever since, doing some great advocacy work for science funding. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Brittany, who's going to talk to us about appropriations, the IRA, and other science policy issues.
Yeah, hi everyone. Good to be with you here today. We're a pretty small group, so please feel free to stop me and ask questions at any time. Yeah, so want to start by kind of just getting like a show of hands, or I'm sharing my screen, so maybe your favorite reaction of who's engaging in policy now, although now I realize you're a student policy group, so hopefully you're all engaging in policy right now. So I'll skip that. I forgot that you guys were a policy group. But these are just a couple of ways that you can engage in policy. And just to tell you, just to give a little more context about kind of my role at AGU, really it's kind of two sides. So really enabling our members to effectively engage policymakers and in the policymaking process, and then ensuring science and scientists are a part of the policymaking process. And so I lobby on behalf of AGU and the Earth and Space Sciences. So I tend to spend a lot of my time kind of working in this second bucket. And just to start us off, kind of set the context, if you will, some key components of passing a bill, I actually stole this from someone I recently heard talk, are really politics, process, and policy. And these are kind of themes you'll hear me talk about a lot as I talk about the different, or the two different bills that we're going to be, or two different sets of bills we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to start with, as you all know, as scientists, kind of demystifying some jargon that we use pretty regularly here on Capitol Hill. So I'm going to talk about the difference between appropriations and budget, and then the difference between authorizers versus appropriators, specifically in the context of members of Congress who are authorizers, or authorizing committees versus the appropriations committee. So I realize this might be a bit small to view, but you can check out the slides later. So appropriations are really a small part of the budget. So in that first box where it says the federal budget, you can see there's revenues, there's outlays. I often kind of equate it to your own personal budget, right? There's how much you make, and then there's how much you have to spend. And then you'll notice there's this turquoise part that says discretionary funding. Discretionary funding is kind of the bucket we're talking about when we talk about appropriations. That's what the Appropriations Committee in Congress controls. You've maybe heard the, if you remember Schoolhouse Rock, like the power of the purse, that's where they were referring to here. And in that second graph, you can, or image, you can kind of see where some of that money gets allocated. And we're going to come back to this. Specifically, if you notice kind of at the bottom where it says discretionary outlays, it's kind of like a dividing path there. You'll notice half of that is for defense. The other half is for non-defense. And most of the science agencies fall into that non-defense portion. So you can kind of already get a sense of, one, where appropriations are in like our grand fiscal scheme, but also to the kind of small part or funding for science plays in that smaller scheme, I'll say. And we'll come back to this. So the next thing that will really help ground our conversation is kind of understanding the difference between authorizers versus appropriators. Very simplified, but authorizers set policy and appropriators are the ones who actually fund the government. And then I listed out on the authorizers a couple of committees that you might have heard of before or be familiar with. Those are all authorizing committees. So like House Science, House Energy and Commerce, which I included because it covers healthcare. There's Senate Commerce, Science, Transportation, and then there's Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, otherwise known as HELP. And you can kind of see as well that those jurisdictions don't exactly line up. The committees in the Senate are not the same as the ones in the House. So then you have appropriators, and appropriators fund the government. And there are 12 subcommittees, 2 that might be of particular interest, and I'll go into more detail. In the second half of our talk is Commerce, Justice, Science, which funds NASA, NOAA, and NSF, as well as the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And and then Labor, Health and Human Services and Education. That's where the National Institutes of Health budget or appropriations is contained. Some of you might know it better as NIH. And I want to say, I want to just say for a quick second that this dichotomy between setting policy and funding the government is a bit of a false dichotomy, because I think one of the most important policy decisions you can make is how much money do you give something, right? Like, how do you prioritize where you spend your money? That in and of itself is a policy decision. Additionally, appropriators do set policies sometimes by encouraging or requiring agencies to do certain things. But traditionally, this is kind of how we talk about the difference between authorizers and appropriators. So I'm going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, but was previously known as Build Back Better, but is really, at the end of the day, a reconciliation bill. And so what do I mean by reconciliation? So reconciliation, it's a special budgetary procedure that allows authorizers to appropriate money, which is why I went through all those key terms to then bring it back around and confuse you. And this is used because it only requires a majority to pass in the Senate, as opposed to appropriation bills, which require at least 60 votes. And you can see right now, Congress or the Senate is at 50-50. And then with the vice president, they have 51. The other thing I want to mention about reconciliation is this is inherently a very partisan political process. Like, no Republican in either chamber voted for the Inflation Reduction Act. Just like I believe the last time this was used, you might recall in 2017, Trump passed major tax cuts, and I'm pretty sure no Democrat voted for that because it happened through reconciliation, which is just inherently, let's say, a little messy. So this is just to give you a sense, because some of you might recall Build Back Better. I believe it was started or initiated by President Biden, and it got scaled down a lot. And this is just to give you a sense of how much it got scaled down. Rosa mentioned there were some people who care about healthcare in the group. So I included a couple of healthcare slides, but I do not cover healthcare. So I'm not going to go over these in detail, but I encourage you to check them out. There are a lot of really important, I will say, policy provisions that honestly you might just care about personally as an individual as well, kind of outside of your scientific interest. So moving more to the energy and environment portions of the bill, I think some of the big themes of the bill are really environmental justice and putting actual money behind President Biden's environmental justice aims. There's a lot in the kind of incentivizing people to adapt clean energy. So there's a lot of tax credits. And there's, I think, a major push as well is this 40% reduction in emissions by 2030. So really an effort by the government to really try to reach or at least make possible our emissions targets. And so here again, key climate and energy funding provisions. So you can get a sense of kind of where this $369 billion on climate and energy provisions are going to. One thing I will note here is notice that the money is spread out over 10 fiscal years. So it starts in fiscal year 22 and it goes all the way to fiscal year 31. So notice that, you know, $30 billion is definitely a lot of money, but $3 billion each year is not necessarily I mean, it's a good chunk of change. It's a good chunk of change, but it's not as much money as you might think. I will also say there are a couple of other provisions that you're not really seeing here. There's a lot on climate resiliency. There's some things for NOAA like supercomputing, things related to coastal restoration. I know talking to Senate Commerce, what they were really looking to do and what most of these projects aim to do is they kind of think about what are projects or initiatives that could use a one-time boost, kind of like what needs a shot in the arm to really make it possible. This is not supposed to replace the general appropriations process. So as Congress moves into oversight, one thing you'll see them doing is really paying lots of close attention, both Democrats and Republicans, to how this money is actually being used and to make sure it's being used for its intended purpose. So again, this just goes into a little more detail, kind of breaking down some of those areas where that money is being spent. So you see a lot of pushes to really bring clean energy to homes and other industries. And then here's climate conservation, and you can kind of see the breakdown of where that money is going. And then you can see energy infrastructure. I know Department of the Office of Science within DOE got a lot of money for improving their own infrastructure in their labs and kind of updating them. And then here's some more details about natural resources sector. And you can, this is more showing changes. So you can see less money to fossil fuels and a lot more money for things like forestry. I'm assuming a large part of that is thinking about wildfires, which is just really like blown out of control recently. And then here's just kind of another breakdown of where some funding is going. And a lot of these provisions in the bill, I will say, had the opportunity to talk to Energy and Commerce Committee. Some of the provisions and ideas in these bills have been around since 2010. So these are ideas that the community has wanted, or provisions that the community has wanted for a really long time and has been thinking about for a really long time. And now these initiatives are not only law, but they're also funded, which is always really critical. So some next steps, I would say, if you're interested in engaging on some of these opportunities, I would say it's really to be on the lookout for funding opportunities from agencies. I've seen some things come out from DOE already. I imagine there will be some more to come out from NOAA. And there are probably other agencies as well. Those are just the ones I'm familiar with, but definitely we will see some money roll down. And then I provided 2 links here. The second one is specifically about if you want to do, they actually have all of the provisions related to climate and energy. It's a CRS report, which is the Congressional Research Service, and they break down every single provision, and you can read more about them. And then the first one is more, it's what the Senate Democrats put out, and it goes into details about all the money, but also how they found the money to fund these programs. But it also does a nice job of kind of thematically, if you're interested in learning more about environmental justice or healthcare, or the energy provisions, you can kind of read their fact pages, and you can also just read the bill. The bill itself, though, is quite massive. I think, and just as we move forward, the thing to look out for will really be money that might come to your community, and also just the oversight Congress is going to be doing on these bills, making sure this money gets spent appropriately. Before I move on to talk about appropriations, I want to see if anyone has any questions or anything that's not clear.
I had one quick question. When you showed the breakdown of things like forestry, and then I think there was something about, I don't remember the exact categories, but they seemed really general and broad. And I was wondering if that was to encompass more things, why they're so broad, why there aren't like specific categories, how those categories are decided, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, so it's really broad. I think if you want to do a deeper dive into any of those areas, I would definitely check out those documents, because a lot of what the spending is it's, for instance, they set some new policy in like the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. And so there's lots of like very specific policy decisions that they made, and now those are getting funded, but they're kind of under the broad category of forestry, if that makes sense. Yeah, and so I think it's just a way for people to conceptualize like where the money is going, because there's so much in the bill. I think there are some big things, but I'm sure there are things in the bill that people haven't even discovered yet, even though there's been so much coverage on the bill. And I'll just emphasize again, I think there's been so much coverage on the bill because it's actual money and funding for these things. But there's also lots of policy changes, which will be interesting to see how they get carried out. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about appropriations, and this is, I think, probably arguably the most important issue in science always. You know, without funding for science, a lot of these other issues kind of go by the wayside, if you will. And so just want to start with a brief sketch of the appropriations process. Make a note up here that the general rule is that once a program is authorized, then it can receive funding. It actually doesn't always happen like that, but the good example I always use is, I don't know if many of you are familiar with ARPA-E. Has anyone heard of ARPA-E before?
Brittany, sorry, before you move on, would it be helpful if I shared my screen so the slides are bigger? I'm not sure if folks can make out the details.
Does this help?
Oh, yeah, that's way better.
I am so sorry.
I should have interrupted you sooner. That is way better.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just have it small on my side. Okay, I'm so sorry about that, everyone. So have people heard of DARPA? Okay, so generally the idea behind these ARPAs, as I'll call them, is that it's kind of where you do pilot projects, but it's very much based on a fail fast model. So let's try something very transformational, and then if it works, great. If not, we're just going to stop and move on to the next project. And so ARPA-E is related to energy products. And I raised this as an example because ARPA-E was created and it didn't receive any funding for 10 years. And then it finally was actually given money, and actually the project actually started. So that's just a note about the thing at the top, and then you can kind of just see the general process. I would say basically it generally just starts with the president's budget release, which is supposed to be in February. That's often not the case. And then the Senate and the House should pass a budget resolution by April 15th. Again, not often the case. Then they should pass a joint resolution. Again, not always the case. And then basically the appropriation bills, kind of the 12 subcommittees pass their bills. Then it would go up to the full committee, and then it would go to the floor of each chamber and be voted on. And then those bills would be conferenced or negotiated together, and then they would go to the president's desk. It almost never happens like that. Generally in the House, what you see is, you might have heard the term omnibus before, where basically they just take a bunch of the appropriation bills, package them together, or sometimes they're called mini buses. So maybe they'll only take 3 or 4 bills and they'll pass them together. And then generally on the Senate side, I can't think of a moment in recent history when the Senate has actually voted on appropriation bills. Generally, they're just voting on one big package at the end of the year to prevent a government shutdown. So, but this is the process. This is how it's supposed to work. And then now we can talk a little bit more about what's actually happening. So I mentioned 12 appropriation subcommittees. So these are the 12 subcommittees. I've mentioned Commerce, Justice, Science, there's Ag, there's Energy and Water, there's Interior and Environment. I've mentioned the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education one, but collectively, this is what funds the entire government, or these are the subcommittees that do. And so what, again, kind of give us some context basically for appropriations, and why I started by saying I think appropriations is the most important issue. So you can kind of see where in this first graph, with like kind of the purple and the red, you can kind of see a good breakdown of where R&D funding is going. And this is from fiscal year 2020, and we're currently in fiscal year 2023 for additional context, but you can kind of get a sense of where money is going. And HHS, that is going to be predominantly the National Institute of Health, thinking about like the CDC. And then on the other figure, oops, sorry, you can kind of see how the money is being used. So again, you can see health, labor, space, science, what have you. So not just by agency, but also by kind of function. And then, so this is kind of a recall to the first graph I showed, showing you where that discretionary spending is. So again, it's in turquoise, and you can see when we talk about discretionary funding, which is the portion that Congress controls, you can see defense, and then you can see non-defense, which is where all that science stuff I just mentioned falls into. And then you can also just see that there's a bit of a Pac-Man effect where all of that other stuff is kind of eating the discretionary portion. And that's become really important over the years. I feel like you often hear maybe Republicans more than Democrats talking about like the national debt, and just kind of being more fiscally responsible. And this is really some of what they're talking about, or what's kind of driving that conversation, if you will. Although arguably what's causing that conversation is, well, you could argue about what's causing that issue, I'll say. And then kind of bringing it all together. So this graph is just showing you R&D as a percent of discretionary spending. So thinking about that Pac-Man effect and breaking down that small slice even more. And then the one on my right, maybe your left, this one is the one I think that we as a scientific society are really concerned about, because this is funding for science in real dollars. So while funding for science, you know, you see it increasing every year over year. And I think some people are like, well, why are you still talking about funding? It seems to be on a good path. But when you look at funding for science in terms of real dollars, so real spending power, the picture is not as, let's say, optimistic. Does anyone know what the current inflation rate is? Yeah, it is 8.3%. And as we move into some of these next set of numbers, I want you to keep 8.3% in mind. So just going to go through a bit of a breakdown of, what for fiscal year 23, what's the outlook right now? So top line, we start with like NASA Science Mission Directorate. And so this encompasses heliophysics, astrophysics, earth science, planetary science, now biological sciences. There's something more to that, but yeah. And then so just to explain the numbers a little bit. So fiscal year 2022 was last fiscal year, and the fiscal year runs from October 1 to September 30th. And then you have the president's budget request. So what he told Congress he would like, and then you can see the House and Senate. And then below each number, I have the percent change from fiscal year 2022. So for instance, if you look at the president's budget request for NASA S&D or Science Mission Directorate, you can see 4.91% versus 8.3%. So already that's a bit of a loss for NASA in terms of actual spending of power. So NASA, the Office of STEM Education, NOAA, and NSF, you can kind of see similar number. You can kind of get a sense of the numbers there. So one thing I will mention in terms of process is that I would not get very attached to these numbers. The House numbers, the House actually did pass they passed half of their appropriation bills. They had disagreement over a lot of bills, including Commerce, Justice, Science. So Commerce, Justice, Science has not passed either chamber yet. But in the Senate, I mentioned before, it's 50-50. So Senate Democrats will need at least 9 Republicans to join them. Actually, no, I'm sorry. They will need 10 Republicans to join them when passing their appropriation bills. But they could not come to an agreement. So before they left for August recess, the Senate Democrats came out with their appropriation numbers. And also in the House side, the House Democrats passed their own appropriation bills. I don't believe any Republicans voted for the bills, or if some did, it was a handful at most. So I would not get attached to these numbers at all. I think the numbers we will end up seeing will probably be somewhere between fiscal year 2022 and some of the lower House numbers, I would say. But we will not see, a lot of the Senate numbers are very ambitious, I'll say. Yeah, and so then this is just interior and environment. So USGS, EPA Office of Science and Technology, and then the Superfund Research Program, which trains environmental health workers. And I'm giving you the high level numbers for these agencies, but there's lots of policy provisions also in these bills that I would encourage you to read and check out. The president's budget request, as I mentioned, it's just a request to Congress. It's kind of like, you can think of it as his Christmas list or his Santa Claus list to Santa Claus. That's like really that's really what it is. But one thing that does stick with the president's budget request often is he'll name areas of priority, or he'll name new initiatives that he'd like to see created. I mentioned the ARPAs before. They're actually going to create an ARPA-H, or ARPA Health, which is supposed to kind of really just fast track research and development in the health space, and that actually is probably going to get funded and created. So kind of ideas stick even if the funding amounts don't. And this is just DOE Office of Science, which funds the national labs and ARPA-E. And then this is Labor, Health and Human Services, so NIH, and then NIHS is the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is found within NIH, but they do environmental health work, which AGU is really engaged on. Just to give you, again, sense of the numbers, I will say NIH numbers, I think of all our science agencies, NIH enjoys massive bipartisan support because, you know, it's really relatable, right? Like, who doesn't know someone with probably a chronic disease or like cancer, Alzheimer's, things like that. So NIH tends to enjoy great bipartisan support and honestly, normally like record-breaking funding levels every year that definitely surpass inflation. So right now, we are under, because the fiscal year ended September 30th and Congress had not passed any bills jointly. So no bills were signed into law, excuse me, but Congress did pass a continuing resolution, or CR. And this is just showing that these have really become very, very typical over the last couple of decades. I've been working in policy since 2013, and Congress has let the government shut down several times in that period, but has never not passed a CR. And you can see by the blue graphs kind of show you how long the CR lasted for. And something to pay attention to is notice that there have been 3 years where we had a CR that just lasted for the whole year, where Congress kind of in some sense gave up and just moved on to the next year. And given that it's an election year and there are lots of politics in play and potentially the party in control in Congress might change, I would say this is not out of the question. Really hoping not, but I'm not saying, but it's not out of the question. And so our continuing resolution, it ends December 16th. The blue box just shows you there was actually funding for other things, a lot of emergency funding in the bill. Often CRs have, they'll have a couple of provisions added to them. Like one of them was a Food and Drug Administration provision had to be approved. And so like that was approved and attached to the CR. And continuing resolutions, generally speaking, because they make agencies, they basically put agencies in a holding pattern. So agencies cannot start new programs, new initiatives, nothing like that. They can't stop anything either. They will need special approval from Congress to do that. They can't transfer money between accounts. And also they're stuck at the, they're stuck right now at the fiscal year 2022 spending levels. And I bring this up because in the Inflation Reduction Act, I mentioned that there were lots of new initiatives and policies and programs. None of those things will be funded, even though the money is there for them, if we continue to remain under a CR, because they're new. And under a CR, agencies cannot do anything new. They just have to continue doing what they're already doing. It's also just bad for planning purposes, right? It's because a lot of times what will end up happening is the agencies will get an increase in money, but they won't get that money till, let's say agencies don't get that money till December. More than likely what that means is that they'll have to push out a bunch of grants or like a lot of funding opportunities. A lot of times you see agencies having to basically spend a lot of money in a short amount of time. And that can just be really administratively hard, but also can lead to just other issues. So it also just makes planning for the next year hard. because agencies are already thinking about their fiscal 24 budget, and it's hard to do when you haven't finished fiscal year 2022. But yeah, and I would say opportunities to engage. So obviously we're still in the process right now. So I think talking to your legislators about the agencies, programs, initiatives you care about and why it's important that we fund these things, but also talking about how, it's not just you who cares about this, it's your community. And that could be other scientists, it could be other grad students, it could be your school, or it could be your actual neighborhood community. Yeah, and that is the end of my presentation. Happy to take any questions. Thank you. And I'm so sorry again about the slides.
That's okay. We can always go back and zoom in on the recording, or if you're amenable, I can send around the slides just to whoever has come. Yeah, thank you. That was really great and informative for me. Even though I went through the training with AGU, I still am constantly confused about how the budget works. I guess I can start with a question, then I'll let other people chip in. I was kind of stuck on that last point about how the provisions in the IRA can't be implemented. And so I keep thinking, what's the point if I understand the political value of the IRA, but if it actually can't be implemented, or maybe it's going to be implemented way later when maybe we could be prioritizing spending in a different way, is this actually an effective tool? Again, what's the point of a policy like the IRA?
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things. So one, I mentioned the thing about the IRA because Mitch McConnell has explicitly said he'd like to do a series of CRs to avoid funding the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. But to some degree, this is more of a stalling tactic, if you will. Like IRA will get implemented. I guess I'll put it that way. And some things probably are already able to be implemented, I would say. It's just that things that are changes or anything new can't get implemented. But I feel like agencies have a little bit of discretion. So there are things that I'm sure, are already starting to move on. It will just be that they will be waiting for that funding. And it might be that really we see the IRA funded for 9 years and not 10 years. But I would say, don't be too discouraged. It will happen. It might just not happen in the way that the IRA is the way IRA is conceptually right now. We might see some changes to it, but I don't, the Democrats and the Republicans, they both still need each other to pass appropriation bills. In fact, I will tell you, House Republicans cannot on their own pass any appropriation bills, because there's a whole segment of their party who won't vote for any appropriations legislation, or won't vote yes affirmatively on any appropriations legislation. So the IRA might not look like what we think it's going to look like, but it will still exist. It'll still get implemented. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And I guess that is part of the reason you establish a policy that would last 10+ years, so that even if it's stalled for 1 or 2 years, it would still impact funding.
Yeah,
and of course, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say too that, I'm trying to think of I can't think of a good analogy, but there are also things Republicans like in IRA that they don't want to get rid of. There are probably things that they really don't like that if they take power, they will try to rewrite or do away with. But there are things they like in that. There are things they like in the bill too. And now they can just blame it on the Democrats. they can just be like, this is all their fault. Even though we like love this, like all that forestry stuff, like we love this because we represent most of the forest, but we're mad at you because you spent money.
So maybe that leads into my question, and great presentation, by the way, Brittany. But how easy is it to unravel funding between, or how easy or difficult is it to unravel the whole funding structure between administrations? Is it like historically been difficult or easy between parties, or how does that kind of work?
Yeah, so I guess what I will say is, I just had this conversation with someone. I think I'm kind of looking at the Affordable Care Act as kind of like a bit of a roadmap for how I might see some of these things rolling out. I think the Affordable Care Act has obviously changed since it was enacted in 2009, but it still exists, right? And there were provisions. I just remember there was like this one tax that was supposed to go into effect on like medical devices that actually Democrats and Republicans came together to overturn because they just didn't like it. So kind of going based off of that example, because politics, I love politics, but politics is crazy. It's part of the reason why I love it. And there's no predicting how people will behave and what will happen. But I would say, generally speaking, it's pretty hard, because then it's also, if you think about it, then all Republicans have to get on board to overturn something. And then in the Senate, they're going to need, you know, as it stands right now, they're going to need a couple of Democrats to get on board with overturning something as well. And then, of course, you know, the administration's not going to like it, and they're going to be like putting all their power behind it too. So I think some things will change regardless, because also, I'll just tell you, like, as a lawyer, legislation and laws are never perfect. So there will be some things that will change, or some things that they'll start and be like, this is not working on the ground. But I see the Inflation Reduction Act, I would say I see a majority of it moving forward, even if, again, it's in a different form than we thought.
Great, thank you so much again.
Mm-hmm.
I have a more broad question for some of our members who maybe have not interacted with politicians before. Do you have just general recommendations for how to best make our voices heard and you know, voice our support for certain provisions?
Yeah, I would say it's like a pretty, it's not gonna say simple. It's a pretty specific formula. One good thing about policy is, like, there's certain things that people kind of expect when you're interacting with them. I think the first one is know what you want, be specific and be like specific about it. Like, it's never support science. It's like, no, I want $11 billion for NSF. Because I've never walked into a congressional office where they didn't tell me they loved science and supported it 100%. So no support science. Two, is this something the legislator, so there are variations to this, but is this something the legislator has the power to do? One, because is this like really a state and local issue, or is this a federal issue? Or can they exact influence in some way? You know, oftentimes letter writing is a big thing on Capitol Hill, and like senators will write like the governor about something, or will be like, what's going on with this, just to exact a little bit more influence. But also, is it something that they would actually do? And the example I tend to use, so do your research. So the example I tend to use is there's a member of Congress who every year introduces a bill to eliminate the EPA. So do not go in their office talking about, oh my gosh, please shore up funding for the EPA Office of Science and Technology. That's a non-starter, if you will. And if that's the situation you're in, maybe take it a couple steps back and think about, well, what's that first step they can take that you can try to like just start getting them going in that direction. Because sometimes it's, this program is really, really important to my community, so please don't vote against this. I'm not asking you to vote for anything, but please don't vote against this, or don't speak out against this, or like just let it happen. And then you've got to connect it, whatever you want. You have to show the legislator why you want it, why they should want it, and why you're not the only person in your community who wants it or needs it, you know, whatever. And the community can be, you know, again, your school, grad students, your specific major, or your actual neighborhood. Community can be defined in a lot of ways. And then I think if you can, this is a little higher up or higher level skills, but is there a story you can tell, like stories or data? You know, I always like the phrase, data makes you credible, but stories make you memorable. So is there something at that intersection or both of those things that you can also share with the legislator? And then also take other people with you. It's just easier when you have congressional meetings if you bring, like, let's say 2, 3, 4 people with you. And then follow up. If they ask questions, if they want information, make sure you follow up. And then I didn't mention this, but I'll mention it now. At the beginning of a meeting, politicians and their staff at the end of the day are public servants. And I think all public servants feel underappreciated and overworked. Thank them for doing something for your community. It doesn't even have to be related to what you want. Just like thank them for their hard work on this issue. That it just tends to kind of smooth the way and like recognize that you realize that even if you don't agree, they are, you know, working to improve your community, let's say. But I think that's like pretty much the formula.
That was really helpful. Thank you.
Yes.
Does anyone have any final questions for Brittany while we have her with us still?
I do have one more question, and maybe this is the last one, but it seems like the Senate is more liberal with funding increases, at least in this year's example, but also you seem to suggest that the House is to, yeah, just maybe lower those a little bit. Is there a reason for that? Are senators just less fickle, maybe because their terms are longer, or is this just a one-off year?
Yeah, I don't know, because I would say that is definitely not always the case. Sometimes the House is much more generous than the Senate. So I don't know, maybe because also both the lead Democrat and lead Republican on the appropriation side, they're both retiring at the end of this Congress. So I know both of them have a vested interest in trying to get these appropriation bills passed. And I will also, a slight tangent, but I will also say no one who sits on the appropriations committee doesn't actually believe in appropriations. Like they all know that their job is to spend money. So generally speaking, you don't see anyone sitting on the appropriations subcommittee who is like an extreme fiscal conservative who believes that like all agencies, we should just cut them all like 10% and we would just all be better off. Generally appropriators are very into spending money. An example I'll give is I can think of the current Senate Republican leader has several things in Alabama named after him because he's such a good appropriator. So they want to spend money, especially they want to be able to bring money back home. That's like the most important thing. But again, those dynamics change. And a lot of times, sometimes what we see is the House will do something, like they might zero out an account or like really lowball it because they know the Senate really, like there's some senator who like that's a priority for them, and they will make sure that that account gets lots of money. Because at the end of the day, right, it's kind of thinking about negotiating, right? Like if you were getting a job offer, you would throw out a number. I always heard you should throw out a number that you're a little bit embarrassed about because you know the other party's going to come back lower. So I think you see similar dynamics there as well. And that might be Senate Democrats, honestly, now that I'm thinking about this, telling Democrats, this is how ambitious we want to go. Like, this is the ceiling, so that maybe Senate Republicans' floor will not be as low.
All right, well, I will stop.